May 10, 1996. A date that still echoes on the slopes of Mount Everest. It began like so many summit attempts before. It hopeful, determined, and organized. But by the end of the day, 8 climbers were dead, frozen, lost, some within sight of their tents, others just meters below the summit. It was the deadliest day in the mountain's history until even darker days would come. So what went wrong? These weren't amateurs. They were guided by some of the most respected names in high altitude. Climbing Rob Hall and Scott Fisher, they had trained for this, paid for it, dreamed of it. They knew the rules, knew the risks, and still everything fell apart. The mountain doesn't care how much you paid, or how many hours you trained, or how badly you want it. It gives nothing. It only takes, yes, a storm hit. A brutal, blinding blizzard that dropped visibility to nothing and temperatures to lethal levels. But the weather wasn't the only killer. Delayed departures, bottlenecks at the Hillary Step, empty oxygen tanks, poor judgment, and perhaps the deadliest mistake of all, refusing to turn back. This is not just a story about snow and ice. It's a story about ambition, about human error at the edge of the world, and what happens when nature reminds us who's really in charge. Why did so many people keep climbing, even as their bodies screamed for rest? Why weren't turnaround times enforced? Who should have survived but didn't? And what really happened? To Rob Hall, stranded in the death zone, speaking to his pregnant wife by radio as he waited to die? This is the real story of the 1996 Everest disaster, of the climbers who never came back and the ones who did. Forever changed by the mid-1990s. Mount Everest was no longer just a place for elite mountaineers. It had become a business. Climbing companies were offering fully guided expeditions for clients who could afford the price tag of upwards of $65,000. And for many, that fee was worth it, because with enough money and some basic training, you could now stand on top of the world. Everest was now a destination, not just for hardened climbers, but for bankers, dentists, filmmakers, people chasing the ultimate bucket list achievement. And guiding them were companies built to profit from that dream. In 1996, major commercial teams dominated the southern route to the summit. One was led by Rob Hall, a New Zealander with a pristine reputation. His company, Adventure Consultants, was one of the most respected on the mountain. Hall had already guided 39 clients to the summit. He was organized, methodical, and deeply committed to safety. The second team was led by American climber Scott Fisher. He ran Mountain Madness, newer, flashier company with a more laid-back approach. Fisher was known for his energy, charisma, and go big or go home attitude. He once said, "I won't be caught dead above the South Col. I'm not going to die on this mountain." But Everest doesn't listen to bravado. The spring of '96 saw a record number of climbers. Over 30 people were set to attempt the summit on May 10th. The weather had delayed previous summit bids, and now, with a narrow window, multiple teams were converging on the same day. There were signs of trouble early on: crowding at high camps, unclear communication between teams, oxygen logistics stretched thin, and many climbers had never faced conditions like what Everest was. Preparing to unleash, it was a mountain ready to punish mistakes, and too many were about to be made. It was still dark when the climbers left Camp 4 on May 10, 1996, high on the South Col. At nearly 8,000 meters, climbers from multiple teams clipped into fixed lines and began the slow, grueling ascent toward the summit of Mount Everest. Rob Hall's Adventure Consultants and Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness teams moved upward. Together, they were joined by climbers from Taiwanese and Indian expeditions. Dozens of people on the same narrow sandspell. In single file, each breath a battle, each step a triumph against gravity and exhaustion. The plan was straightforward: depart around midnight, reach the summit by 2 p.m., and descend well before nightfall. It was the golden rule of high altitude. Climbing never summit late, but almost immediately. Problems began. Some climbers were slower than expected. Others misplaced gear or needed help setting up oxygen systems. Bottlenecks formed early at the Expizo balcony. Worse yet, when climbers reached the Hillary Stepa, nearly vertical wall of rock and ice near the summit, they found no ropes in place. This delay was critical. Climbers waited, exposed to wind and cold, burning oxygen while standing still. Some spent over an hour there, motionless, losing time and strength, but summit fever had taken hold. They'd come too far, trained, it's too hard, spent too much. Most weren't willing to turn back by midday. The summit saw a crowd. Rob Hall reached the top with his client, Doug Hansen. Scott Fisher trailed behind, visibly struggling, but determined. Other clients celebrated with photos. Cheers, even satellite calls to loved ones. But they were celebrating on borrowed time. It was after 2 p.m. when many still lingered near the peak. They should have turned back hours earlier. They were exhausted, disoriented, and dangerously low on oxygen. But Everest's view seduced them. Then the clouds rolled in. A sudden blizzard slammed the mountain without warning. Visibility dropped to near zero. Snow fell sideways in whiteout conditions. Ropes vanished. Under ice, the route became invisible. Climbers were trapped. Some turned the wrong direction. Others slipped and fell. Confusion spread. Radios crackled with panic. Sherpas tried to lead people down, but even they were overwhelmed. Oxygen tanks emptied faster than planned, and in the freezing dark, climbers began collapsing on the trail. It was no longer a climb. It was a survival test in the death zone by the time night fell. More than 30 people were still high on the mountain, lost, exhausted, freezing. Some huddled in small groups, waiting for a rescue that wouldn't come. Others, like Rob Hall and Doug Hansen, remained near the summit immobile, exposed, and in deep trouble. What had started as a historic day on Everest had turned into a living nightmare, and the worst was still to come. The storm hit fast, and it hit hard by late afternoon on May 10, 1996. The summit of Everest vanished into a swirling wall of white. Climbers could no longer see more than a few feet in front of them. Fixed ropes disappeared. Beneath SNOWDRIFTS, wind speeds surged over 70 miles per hour. Temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Celsius, visibility 0. At that altitude, known as the death zone. Every breath is a fight. The air is so thin. Even simple thoughts take effort. Muscles weaken, judgment blurs. Hope flickers. People became scattered across the upper slopes. Some had summited and were descending blindly. Others were still pushing upward, desperate to reach the top. Ignoring the worsening conditions, there was no clear communication. Radios cut in and out. Headlamps were lost in the snow. Then dash people began to collapse. One by one, climbers ran out of oxygen. They sat down in the snow, disoriented, unable to move. Others passed by, unsure whether they were just resting or dying. Near the south summit, a group of 12 climbers, including members from Hall's and Fisher's teams, got lost in the blizzard. They dug a shallow trench in the snow and tried to huddle for warmth. They had no shelter, no rescue plan, and the storm didn't let up. Some would never stand up again. Meanwhile, near the Hillary Step, Rob Hall radioed down. He was still with Doug Hansen. Doug was unconscious. Unable to walk, Rob refused to leave him. He called base camp, spoke to his team, gave updates through the night. Later, he made one final call to his wife, Jan Arnold, who was pregnant with their first child. His voice was weak. He told her he loved her and said goodbye further down the mountain. Scott Fisher was alone. Sherpas had tried to help him descend, but he was incoherent. He may have been suffering from HACE, high altitude, cerebral edema. He couldn't walk, could barely speak. Eventually, he stopped moving altogether. Climbers like Beckweathers, who had collapsed near the south summit, were presumed dead and left behind. Others were buried in snowdrifts. Some fell, some froze in place. Back at Camp 4, survivors trickled in, dazed and frostbitten. They didn't all know yet who had lived, or who hadn't by morning. The mountain was silent again, and littered with bodies frozen. Where they fell, the world's highest peak had become a graveyard. The storm had lasted just a few hours, but it was enough to take 8 lives, and for many who made it down, the mountain would haunt them forever. When the storm finally cleared on May 11th, the scale of the disaster came into focus. 8 climbers were confirmed dead. Others were severely injured, frostbitten, traumatized, barely alive, and every survivor had a story soaked in agony and impossible decisions. Among the dead were 2 of the most experienced guides on the mountain, Rob Hall and Scott Fisher. Rob died alongside his client, Doug Hansen, refusing to leave him behind. Even in his final hours, Rob kept radioing base camp, reporting his position, holding on as long as he could. He spoke to his wife, Jan Arnold, from a satellite phone, knowing he wouldn't make it back. Scott Fisher was found alone, higher up, too exhausted, too ill. He had been battling altitude sickness before the summit attempt and deteriorated rapidly in the storm, but not everyone perished. Beckweathers, a Texan pathologist, was left for dead twice. His teammates thought he was gone. He lay unconscious in the snow, his body frozen solid. And yet, he woke up somehow, blind in one eye, covered in frostbite. He stood up and walked along through the storm. Back to Camp 4, Beck's survival was nothing short of a miracle. He would go on to have multiple surgeries, lose his nose, both hands, and still tell his story with grace and humor. Anatoly Bukreev, the lead guide for Scott Fisher's team, became one of the heroes. Without bottled oxygen, he descended quickly, assessed the chaos, and went back up again and again through the blizzard to save stranded climbers. He rescued several people, risking his life each time. Some criticized his decision to leave clients earlier, but his bravery saved lives. Many consider him one of the key reasons more people didn't die that night. Others, like John Krakauer, survived due to experience, caution, and circumstance. He stuck to turnaround times, descended quickly, and made it to camp just in time. His book, Into Thin Air, would immortalize the tragedy and ignite fierce debate. The 1996 disaster exposed the fragility of life. Above 8,000 meters, it showed how quickly things spiral out of control, and it left behind painful questions. Who do you save when everyone needs saving? When do you turn back? And what price are we willing to pay for the top of the world? The 1996 Everest disaster shook the world. It made global headlines, and for the first time, the public got a brutal look into the dark side of high-altitude climbing in. The months that followed, survivors gave interviews, wrote books, and shared their stories. The most famous was Into Thin Air by John Krakauer, who had been on Rob Hall's team. The book painted a harrowing picture of miscommunication, ego, and chaos. It became a bestseller but also sparked fierce controversy. Some climbers felt it unfairly blamed individuals like Anatoly Bukreev. Others argued it exposed an uncomfortable truth. Mount Everest had become a business, and people were dying because of it. The tragedy raised big questions. Now many of those questions still don't have clear answers. Should climbers need a certain level of experience before attempting Everest. Should the number of permits be limited each year? Should guides abandon clients who refuse to turn back, even when they're at risk? In the years since, changes have come but slowly. Some companies now vet clients more rigorously. Turnaround times are more strictly enforced. Guides are better trained to handle emergencies. But the mountain remains crowded each spring. The same pattern repeats. Hundreds of climbers, dozens of expedition companies, bottlenecks on narrow ridges, and every so often. Another tragedy. What happened in 1996 didn't stop people from coming. If anything, it inspired more. Some are drawn by the danger, others by the fame, and many perhaps most by the deep personal need to test themselves. But Everest can't be conquered. It allows you to stand on top briefly, and only if it lets you. What we learned in 1996 was this: nature doesn't negotiate. It doesn't care how much you trained, how much you paid, or how badly you want it. It just is. Mount Everest is the highest point on Earth. It's been called the roof of the world, a place where the air is thin and survival is never guaranteed. But even more than a mountain, Everest is a mirror. It reflects everything we bring to a tower: ambition, our fear, our need to prove something. For some, it represents achievement. For others, escape. But for everyone who climbs it, Everest demands a price. The 1996 disaster wasn't just a freak accident. It was the result of 100 small decisions made under extreme pressure, moments where people chose risk over retreat, belief over logic, tiny choices that, one by one, added up to catastrophe. And that's what makes the story so haunting. Because it wasn't just nature that killed those climbers, it was human nature. Our need to keep going when we should stop, to ignore pain, to chase a summit, even when the sky turns black. Rob Hall could have turned back. Doug Hansen could have said no. Scott Fisher might have stayed at camp, but they didn't, because they believed they could make it, and maybe on a different day they would have. But Everest doesn't care about belief. It doesn't care about dreams or drive or how much someone paid to be there. And yet, people still go each year. Hundreds take on the same journey. They stand in the same place, face the same winds, look out over the same world from 29,032 feet, and each one gambles with the same odds. Some return with stories, others don't return. At all, what happened in 1996 serves as a warning, but also a reminder of how fragile we are, how much we're willing to risk for a dream, and how sometimes even the strongest fall short. So if you ever hear the mountain calling, listen closely, because sometimes the most courageous thing isn't going up, it's knowing when to turn back. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe for more real tales of survival, ambition, and the human spirit. Until next time, stay safe, stay humble, and respect the climb.